Have you ever seen something so small and harmless, yet felt a chill crawl up your spine for no logical reason? Most people think life announces its disasters with thunder, screaming, shattering glass, or sirens. But sometimes, the moment that changes everything arrives with nothing more than the soft thud of fabric landing in a trash bin. That's all it took. A sound so quiet that anyone else would have ignored it, to jolt something deep inside me awake. For months, I had lived inside a fog after losing my son, moving through each day as though grief had wrapped its hands around my throat. I forgot to eat some nights, forgot to open the curtains in the morning, forgot how laughter even felt. But the day I watched my daughter-in-law casually toss my granddaughter's baby blanket into the trash, the fog didn't just lift, it tore open. I was walking past the kitchen when I saw her. She didn't hesitate, didn't double-check, didn't fold it or handle it like something fragile or sentimental. She pinched it between two fingers and dropped it into the trash can like it was contaminated. My heart lurched. This wasn't just any blanket, it was the blanket. The one my son brought home from the hospital the day his little girl was born. The one he wrapped around her tiny body when he whispered that she was his entire world. The blanket that still smelled faintly of lavender detergent and innocence. And my daughter-in-law threw it away as if it carried no history, no emotion, no trace of the man we had just buried. Grief makes you notice what others pretend not to see. She walked away without even pressing the foot pedal to make sure it sank deep into the bin. It lay on top of discarded coffee filters and grocery receipts, its faded yellow edge peeking out like it was begging to be rescued. I froze, staring at it, feeling a surge of something I hadn't felt in months. An instinct, sharp and old, like the tightening grip of a mother who senses danger long before she understands it. My daughter-in-law had been cold lately, distant in a way that felt deliberate rather than mournful. People grieve differently. I'd repeated that line over and over to myself. But then there were the whispers on the phone she always stepped outside to take, the locked drawers she never allowed me near, the hollow excuses she offered each time I asked about my son's final days. My son's death had been labeled an horrible accident, something freakish and tragic, but the way she behaved afterward nagged at me like a bruise I kept bumping into, and now here she was, throwing away the last thing he ever held with tenderness. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the blanket was stained. Maybe she meant to wash it later. Maybe she thought it carried too many painful memories. But a deeper part of me, one that had been dormant, wounded, quiet, knew better. When someone throws away the only thing connecting you to the last moment of joy in your life, it isn't about clutter. It's about erasing something or hiding something. And once I allowed myself to consider that possibility, my heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I waited until I heard the front door click shut behind her. Then I walked into the kitchen slowly, like the blanket might move if I startled it. My fingers trembled when I reached into the trash and lifted it out. It felt heavier than I expected, too heavy for its size. The weight wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Something was inside it, something that shouldn't have been. My pulse quickened as I brought it to my chest, the familiar softness pressing against me like a memory trying to breathe through the fabric. I carried it into my room, shutting the door behind me with a quiet finality. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I spread the blanket out carefully, smoothing the wrinkles as though I were soothing a child. And that's when I felt it again, the unmistakable hardness inside one of the corners. My breath caught. It wasn't a button. It wasn't stitching. It was something placed there, something hidden. My daughter-in-law hadn't tossed this blanket away because it was useless. She tossed it away because it was dangerous. And if something is dangerous to a person like her, it might be the only thing that could save someone like me. I traced my fingers over the fabric until I found a small, uneven bulge. Someone had sewn it into the lining, clumsily, desperately, as though they didn't have time to hide it anywhere else. My heart clenched so hard I pressed my palm to my chest to steady myself. Had my son done this? Did he hide something in this blanket before he died? Was this a message I had ignored for months? Was this the reason she wanted it gone? My breath grew shallow, the room spinning slightly as panic clawed at my throat. But beneath the panic was something else. Purpose. A spark of the woman I once was before grief tried to bury me alive. I pulled at the seam gently. Not enough to tear the blanket, but just enough to widen the opening. And there it was, a small, cold object wrapped inside another layer of fabric. The sight of it made every hair on my arm stand straight up. I didn't even know what it was yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. Someone wanted this hidden. Someone wanted this gone. Someone wanted this secret buried with my son. I held the weight in my hand, staring down at the blanket that had once comforted a newborn and was now trembling in the hands of a grandmother who had just stepped into a truth she never asked for. How many times had I walked past this blanket? Oh, how many times could I have discovered this earlier? How close had I come to throwing away the only clue that could rewrite everything I thought I knew about my son's death? And that's when it hit me, not like a whisper, but like a scream ripping through my mind. Because when I finally opened that hidden corner and felt what was inside, I realized I was holding proof that my son hadn't died the way she claimed. What would you do if the thing meant to cradle a newborn's warmth instead carried a secret cold enough to stop your breath? My hands hovered above the small lump stitched into one corner, trembling with an anticipation I wasn't emotionally prepared for. It wasn't just the weight that unsettled me, it was the deliberate nature of it. Blankets don't sew themselves shut. Secrets don't hide without purpose. And the way my daughter-in-law had discarded it so quickly, so confidently, so dismissively told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was inside this fabric wasn't meant to be found, not by me, not by anyone. My throat tightened as I slid my fingers into the seam and carefully pulled it apart, each thread loosening like the unraveling of my own assumptions. Inside the lining was a small black object wrapped tightly in a cloth, almost like someone wanted to protect it even as they hid it. My breath hitched. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't a keepsake. It was rectangular, cold, smooth, a phone, a tiny burner phone, the kind people use when they want conversations that don't follow them. And the moment I felt its shape, something deep inside me whispered, this wasn't just forgotten. This was planted. This was meant for someone who would look closely enough to find it. For a few seconds, I couldn't even move. I couldn't think. My heart pulsed so forcefully that I felt it in my fingertips. Why would my daughter-in-law throw away a blanket that held a hidden phone? Why hide the phone at all? Why inside something sentimental? Why now? My breath grew shallow, and a slick fear wrapped itself around my spine. Had my son put this here? Had he needed help? Had he known something was coming? Had he tried to leave me a message? The ache in my chest sharpened into something heavier than grief, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to confront since the night we lost him. Suspicion, not born from imagination but from signs I had ignored because I trusted the wrong person. My daughter-in-law's coldness after his death wasn't distant grief. It was relief wearing the mask of sorrow. My fingers shook as I unwrapped the cloth and revealed the small black phone. It looked cheap, barely used, but charged, like someone anticipated needing it. There was a knot of dread in my stomach as I pressed the power button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen lit up with a faint blue glow that washed over my hands like a ghost. A password prompt appeared. 4 digits. I stared at the blank boxes, my mind racing. What would my son use? His birth year? His daughter's birthday? My birthday? But then something else came to me. Something simple. Something he always said because he believed it with his whole heart. Mom always knows. I typed the last 4 digits of my phone number. The screen unlocked. My heart dropped. The home screen wasn't empty. It was flooded photos, audio files, text messages, voice memos, some marked unread, others archived like someone had been carefully documenting something. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my pulse matching the frantic tap, tap, tap of my fingers as I scrolled. There were folders, a gallery titled Proof, another titled Notes, another titled Don't Delete. My chest tightened painfully. Innocent people don't hide things labeled proof. Innocent people don't fear their own death before it happens. I opened the proof folder first. The first photo hit me like a punch to the ribs. It was my son, not smiling, not posing, not in a moment of joy. He looked terrified, face bruised, eyes wide, jaw clenched. I slapped the hand over my mouth as the sound of my own gasp strangled out of me. The next photo showed a screenshot of his bank account, the balance alarmingly low despite the steady job he held. Another screenshot, text messages begging someone to stop threatening him. Another, a video clip of him whispering into the dark, his voice breaking as he apologized to someone. Maybe me, maybe his daughter, maybe himself for letting it get this far. I stopped breathing. My entire body felt like it had turned to ice. Why was this on a hidden phone? Why had no one shown me this? Why did my daughter-in-law throw away the blanket containing it? My hand pressed to my chest as though trying to hold my heart in place. The walls of my room seemed to close in around me, my breathing ragged, uneven, as reality shifted under my feet. This wasn't grief anymore. This was discovery. This was the difference between a tragedy and a crime. And I had stumbled into it because I couldn't bear to see a baby blanket treated like trash. If my son hid this phone inside his daughter's blanket, it was because he trusted only one person left in his life, his mother. He knew I would protect his child. He knew I would never throw it away. He knew I would find it. He knew I loved him enough to look deeper when no one else would. But the part that shattered me wasn't the fear in his eyes or the bruises on his skin. It was realizing that he had been alone when he needed me most. And the woman I had welcomed into my home, defended, supported, comforted, she had been the one pushing him further into danger. I clicked back to the home screen and noticed several unread messages blinking at the top. Messages from unknown numbers. Messages from her numbers. Messages with timestamps from the days leading up to his death. My vision blurred as tears finally broke free, slipping down my cheeks. The blanket, once a symbol of newborn innocence, had become a vault of secrets, a container for the last truths my son left behind. And as terrifying as those truths were, I knew I couldn't stop now, not when the answers were finally within reach. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and steadied my breath. Whatever this phone contained, whatever this blanket had guarded, whatever my daughter-in-law wanted to erase, it wasn't going to stay hidden anymore. My son deserved better. My granddaughter deserved safety. And I deserved the truth. Because as the messages began opening one by one, I realized I wasn't holding a forgotten phone. I was holding the first thread that could unravel a lie far darker than grief ever prepared me for. What if the camera roll on a stranger's phone revealed more truth about your family than the people living in your house ever did? I don't know how long I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, the blanket pooled around me like a soft yellow halo mocking the darkness I was discovering. The phone felt heavier now. Heavier with every breath I took, heavier with every picture I had already seen, heavier with the realization that my son had been quietly documenting his own fear while I walked through my days believing I still had time to help him. In the dim light of my bedroom, the glow of the screen felt like a spotlight exposing every blind spot I had ever had as a mother. I tried to steady my hands, but they trembled with the kind of dread you only feel when you're about to learn something you'll never be able to forget. There are truths that crack your heart, and then there are truths that bury your old life entirely, and I could feel myself standing at the edge of the second kind. I opened the next image, bracing myself, but nothing could have prepared me for what filled the screen. It was a close-up photo of my son's wrist. Bruised, swollen, finger-shaped marks wrapping around it like a cruel signature. My breath caught. A noise escaped me, half gasp, half cry, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. The bruising wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It told a story of force, of control, of someone who wanted to dominate him. My mind spun, memories colliding with this image. The times he wore long sleeves in the summer, the excuses he made about tripping, the way he often kept one hand in his pocket as if hiding something. How had I not seen it? How had I believed him when he said everything was fine? The greatest trick abusers play is convincing everyone around the victim that nothing is wrong. Another photo loaded before I could gather myself. This one was of the living room in the house he shared with her. Furniture overturned, a lamp broken on the floor, picture frames scattered, one cracked down the center. It wasn't staged, it wasn't subtle. It looked like chaos frozen mid-breath, a fight, a struggle. A moment of violence that no one outside those walls knew happened. I felt a wave of nausea crash through me. All those times my daughter-in-law smiled emptily. All those times she described him as moody or unstable. All those times she brushed off questions with a casual flick of her voice. Maybe she wasn't giving explanations at all. Maybe she was laying alibis. I swiped again. The next set of screenshots showed messages I recognized from apps he never used with me, the kind you download when you need privacy, or when you have something to hide because someone else is watching you too closely. In one thread, he wrote someone, "She took my wallet again, says she's keeping it until I stop accusing her." In another, "I think she's tracking my car. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." My throat closed, my vision blurred. My heart thudded so loudly I could hear it over the ringing in my ears. There was no misreading these messages, no twisting them into something innocent. My son hadn't just been scared, he had been hunted inside his own home, and no one had believed him, not even me. I swiped again, and again. Each image was another punch to the ribs. A recording popped up, one I didn't dare play yet or risk collapsing under the weight of it. The thumbnail showed my son's face half lit in darkness, eyes hollow, jaw shaking. Another folder held photos of receipts showing large withdrawals from his account, withdrawals he never mentioned, withdrawals that didn't match his spending or lifestyle. Someone was draining him. Someone wanted control. Someone wasn't satisfied until he was financially, emotionally, and physically vulnerable. Then a picture appeared that made me drop the phone onto the blanket. It was of my granddaughter Tiny, asleep in her crib, wearing that same baby blanket over her small legs. But what made my blood turn cold was the edge of the photo, where part of a shadow hovered, someone standing just outside the frame, someone watching her, someone whose outline I recognized too well. The cruelty of it slammed into me. The phone wasn't only documenting abuse toward my son, it was documenting danger surrounding his child. This wasn't just about a crime against a man, it was about a threat against an innocent life who didn't understand the monsters living in her home. My breath stuttered as I picked up the phone again. I felt older than my years, cracked open by grief and revelation, but something new was rising inside me. Something sharper, stronger, angrier. A mother's instinct, a grandmother's instinct. The instinct of someone who had been asleep for too long but was now wide awake and burning. I opened one more file, needing answers even if they broke me. It was a video clip only 5 seconds long, shaky footage, like my son recorded it secretly. In it, he whispered just one sentence. "If you find this, Mom, check the messages." My hand flew to my mouth. Tears blurred everything. The sound of his voice, so soft, so tired, so resigned, ripped through every part of me. He had left this for me. He had trusted me to find the truth. He had known something was coming, and suddenly I understood something with terrifying clarity. My daughter-in-law hadn't thrown away a blanket. She had thrown away evidence. Evidence that proved my son didn't die the way she claimed. Evidence that she had reason to fear. Evidence that could unravel the life she built on lies. I stared down at the phone, my pulse hammering. Every instinct in my body screamed that I had just stepped into a truth more dangerous than grief itself. And I knew there was no turning back now, not when my son's last plea was echoing in my ears. Because when I opened the message thread he begged me to check, I realized I wasn't just learning what happened to my son, I was about to learn who wanted him gone. How do you breathe when words on a screen confirm the nightmare your heart sensed long before your mind dared to accept it? For a long moment, I simply stared at the blinking notification on the phone, my son's final whispered plea echoing through me like a ghost refusing to fade. My fingers hovered motionless above the screen, as though some part of me still prayed that what I was about to open would make sense in some gentle way, some way that didn't twist reality into something sharp and unrecognizable. But grief has a strange ability. It can blind you completely, but it can also sharpen every instinct to a razor's edge. And right then, I felt a piercing clarity I hadn't felt since the day before my son died. I knew, deep in my bones, that these messages were about to rewrite the story I had been told, the story she forced me to believe. My heart thudded heavily as I tapped on the message thread he'd marked. The first message at the top was time-stamped 2 months before his death. It wasn't a conversation. It was a warning to himself, a note he'd typed as if he needed documentation of the truth. She isn't who she was when we married. I felt my chest tighten as I scrolled. She gets angry over nothing. I can't predict her. I can't keep up. He had been living in fear long before I ever sensed anything was wrong. Shame washed over me like icy water. How had I not known? Scrolling made everything worse. The next messages weren't notes. These were actual conversations, painful ones. One from her number. Stop embarrassing me. Stop talking about leaving. You know what will happen if you push me. My stomach knotted. Another message came from an unknown number responding to her. It needs to look natural. Keep him where you can watch him. My blood went cold. The phrasing wasn't vague. It wasn't emotional lashing. It was coordinated, controlled, planned. My breath stuttered as I read further. He's getting suspicious. Then stage it sooner. Don't worry. He trusts me. He won't expect anything. My eyes blurred with tears I didn't remember releasing. It felt like reading a script for a horror film, except the characters weren't strangers. So gall. They were the people living inside my family, weaving themselves into our daily life while plotting the destruction of the person I loved most in the world. I scrolled again, my heartbeat pounding like a drum pressed against my ribs. The messages changed tone as the days crept closer to his death. Her tone grew colder. His grew more fragmented. There were missed calls from him to her that she never answered. There were messages he sent late at night. We need to talk. Please don't be angry. I just want peace. He sounded like a man negotiating with someone who held all the power and none of the empathy. My hand shook harder with each message I read, the ache in my chest tightening until it felt like it would split me open. Then I reached the message thread that finally broke me. It was one line from her number. Once it's over, everything will be easier. There was no grief in those words. No hesitation. No love. Only anticipation, calculation, a plan spoken aloud before the execution. Every instinct in my body screamed that my son had known he was in danger. He had known he wasn't safe. He had known something was coming, something he hoped I would uncover if he couldn't escape it himself. As I kept scrolling, a message from an unknown number appeared. The insurance is already processed. Just make it look like he slipped. My blood ran cold. Every cell in my body felt like it was vibrating, the type of message that only exists when someone believes they're safe from consequences. And then, the final text, the one that froze the breath in my lungs. It's done. 2 words, 2 syllables. The cruel ending of a conversation that had taken my son's life. A chill spread through me as I realized what this phone contained wasn't suspicion. It was evidence. Cold, raw, undeniable evidence. And my daughter-in-law had tried to throw it away like an unwanted reminder of a story she wanted erased. I sank back into the bed, the blanket still draped over my lap, its once soft fabric now carrying the weight of betrayal so thick it felt suffocating. Memories of her behavior after his death began flashing in my mind with new clarity. The way she avoided looking at me too long, the way she rushed through explanations, the way she insisted on handling everything quickly so we could move forward. She didn't want to move forward. She wanted to cover her tracks. The realization made my stomach twist with revulsion. How many meals had I eaten across from her at the table? How many times had she handed me my granddaughter with those same hands that typed those messages? How many times had I mistaken her silence for grief when it was actually strategy? It's one thing to lose a child to fate. It's another to lose them to someone who smiled in your face while tightening the noose behind your back. I set the phone down on the blanket, pressing my hand over my mouth as sobs finally broke loose. Quiet, shaky, aching sobs that felt like they were pulling pieces of my soul out with them. Not only because my son was gone, but because he had died believing he had no one left to help him. He had been trapped, isolated, manipulated. And the only lifeline he had managed to send out was this hidden phone, tucked into the one place he knew his daughter-in-law would never look closely enough to suspect her own baby's blanket. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and forced myself to breathe. I wasn't weak, not anymore. This wasn't just grief. This was purpose. I had stumbled into the truth by instinct, but now that I had seen it, I couldn't look away. I couldn't pretend it wasn't real. My son didn't need my mourning. He needed my resolve. My granddaughter didn't need a quiet grandmother. She needed a protector. and the monster who had pretended to be family wasn't going to win. Because as I stared at those messages, I realized I wasn't just uncovering what happened, I was uncovering who I needed to become to finish what my son started. Have you ever replayed a memory so many times that one day it suddenly sounds different, like the truth was always there, whispered between the cracks? For months after my son died, I had forced myself to accept the version of events my daughter-in-law presented because grief makes you vulnerable in a way that feels almost childlike. You cling to any explanation that hurts the least. You convince yourself that tragedy is random, that heartbreak is accidental, that loss is the universe acting blindly, not someone you welcomed into your home sharpening the knife behind your back. But as I sat in my dim room, the hidden phone warm in my trembling hand, I felt something inside me shift, almost like a puzzle piece flipping over after months of being lodged upside down. The messages, the documented bruises, the fear in his voice, they weren't new information. They were confirmations of suspicions I had buried because facing them meant shattering the illusion of safety I had built for myself and my granddaughter. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive suddenly. It simply rises from the ashes of the lies you once mistaken for comfort. Closed my eyes and let my mind travel back to the night he died, stepping into that memory with a clarity I didn't know I still possessed. The phone rang around 2 a.m., jarring me awake like a thunderclap. My daughter-in-law's voice had been shaky, but not in the way grief shakes a person. It was too controlled, too performative, like an actress stepping on stage before the audience took their seats. She said it was an accident, a fall, something sudden and unstoppable. In my shock, I didn't question her tone, didn't question the rushed details, didn't question why she seemed more focused on logistics than loss. I was too busy collapsing into the numbness that follows the unimaginable. But now, sitting here in the present, remembering her voice with fresh ears, I realized something horrifying. Her tone that night wasn't panic. It was anticipation. I remembered arriving at the hospital and seeing her sitting in the corner, not tear-streaked or hysterical, but exhausted in a way that didn't match the moment. Her eyes weren't swollen, her hands weren't shaking. Instead, she paced with restless energy, like someone waiting for paperwork to finalize rather than someone whose husband had just taken his last breath. Even then, I explained it away. Grief shows itself differently in everyone, I told myself. But that wasn't grief. It was the residue of adrenaline. The aftermath of doing something irreversible. The calm that follows decision, not disaster. As these memories resurfaced, they collided violently with the evidence on the phone. The bruises, the messages, the trapped sound of my son's recorded whisper. "If you find this, Mom," the realization that he had likely sensed his own death approaching, that he had been living with someone who loved control more than they loved him, sent a shiver up my spine so sharp it felt like ice cracking beneath my ribs. The guilt hit next, heavy, suffocating, relentless. How had I not seen her manipulation, her possessiveness, her coldness? Why had I defended her when neighbors raised concerns? Why had I believed her tears when now I knew they were nothing more than props? It is one of the cruelest truths of life. Sometimes the person you should fear most is the one standing closest to you in family photos. I stood up from the bed, pacing the room in small, uneven circles, the way people do when their hearts are trying to outrun their thoughts. I remembered visiting their house months before he died, noticing how tense he seemed around her, how quickly he changed the subject when she walked into the room. I remembered him asking me once, so softly I almost missed it, whether I thought people could become different after marriage. I'd laughed it off, said something cliché about stress and responsibility. I didn't ask why he asked. I didn't lean in. I didn't listen. The weight of that failure pressed down on my chest like a stone. But guilt and clarity can coexist, and when they do, they create a kind of fire. A quiet, relentless fire that spreads through your veins and tells you one thing with absolute certainty: you cannot stay silent anymore. I walked to the mirror and caught my reflection, tired eyes, thinning hair, wrinkles carved by years of both joy and sorrow. For the first time in a long time, I didn't see a broken mother. I saw a witness, a survivor. A woman who had just discovered the final truth about her son's death and could no longer pretend it was an accident of fate. My hands steadied, my breath deepened, the fear in my stomach hardened into resolve. I knew what I had to do. I knew who I had to become. I wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. I was the only living person who had seen the truth hidden inside that blanket, and there was no universe where I would allow my granddaughter to grow up under the shadow of a woman capable of such cruelty. My son's final act wasn't dying. It was leaving a trail, a breadcrumb path sewn into his daughter's baby blanket, a plea for justice disguised as something ordinary. My heart broke anew as the weight of that realization sank in. He had known his time was running out. So bad he had known he might not make it out of the situation alive. And instead of calling the police or a friend, he had trusted me, quietly, silently, desperately. He had trusted me to find the phone, to open it, to read every horrifying message, and to stitch together the truth he couldn't speak openly. You don't walk away from a responsibility like that. You rise to it. I sat back on the bed, the blanket still warm from my lap. I traced my fingers over its soft edge, feeling the place where the phone had been hidden, imagining his hands sewing it closed in fear, imagining his heart pounding as he tucked it inside the one object he knew I wouldn't ignore. Tears blurred my vision again, but this time they weren't just from grief. They were from determination, because the moment I accepted my son hadn't died by accident, I understood the truth that would guide every step I took next. Someone in my house had murdered him, and it was now my turn to uncover the rest of their plan. What happens when the quietest person in the room suddenly becomes the one holding the truth everyone else has been running from? The morning after I fully absorbed the truth about my son's death, I woke with a kind of heaviness that wasn't exhaustion. It was purpose, a weight that steadied rather than crushed me. My hands still shook from the emotional whiplash of everything I had learned, but somewhere beneath that tremor was a steadier pulse, a growing certainty that I couldn't postpone what needed to be done. I'd spent months drowning in grief, letting my daughter-in-law direct the narrative of what happened, letting myself believe that tragedy was a coincidence instead of a consequence. But the phone hidden inside the blanket changed everything. It wasn't just evidence, it was a message. Yes, a final message from a son who died waiting for someone to believe him. As I sat in the early morning light with the phone resting in my palm, I understood something with terrifying clarity. I couldn't bring him back, but I could bring the truth into the light. And maybe, in doing so, I could save the one person he loved even more than his own life, his daughter. I wrapped the blanket carefully and tucked the phone inside my purse, my fingers lingering on the soft fabric. There was a strange comfort in knowing that the very object my daughter-in-law had tried to discard was now the thing that would unravel her lies. It reminded me of all the small things mothers notice: lost earrings, strange bruises, shifts in tone or routine, and how those tiny details, ignored by the world, become maps when violence hides behind closed doors. As I dressed, I tried to ignore the burn of guilt rising in my chest. If I had looked closer months ago, maybe I could have saved him. But regret is a backward-facing emotion, and what I needed now was forward motion. Grief paralyzes you, but truth forces you to move. The walk to the lawyer's office felt surreal, almost dreamlike. The world around me moved as usual. Cars humming, neighbors chatting, birds calling from their perches. But none of it reached me. It was as though I was walking through a glass tunnel, the real world separated from the storm inside me. The lawyer I had chosen wasn't random. He was someone my son once mentioned when handling a property dispute. Someone firm, meticulous, impossible to intimidate. Someone who wouldn't hear my story and dismiss it as the ramblings of a grieving mother desperate for answers. The receptionist barely looked up when I arrived, but she must have seen something strange in my expression, because her smile softened and she ushered me in quicker than usual. When the lawyer stepped inside the room, I didn't begin with tears or pleas for help. I simply reached into my bag, placed the blanket and the phone on the desk, and watched the confusion flicker across his face. Then slowly, steadily, I explained everything, not as a story, but as a sequence of facts the world had ignored. The bruises, the screenshots, the messages detailing plans, threats, financial manipulations, the video recording of my son's trembling voice, the timeline that connected text messages to the days leading up to his death. And the most damning detail of all, the attempt to throw away the blanket that contained the hidden phone. As he scrolled through the files, his face shifted, not dramatically, but subtly, the way someone's face changes when they walk from a dim hallway into bright sunlight. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. He clicked through each message twice, then a third time, tapping notes into his legal pad with slow, controlled strokes. He was piecing together something enormous, something dangerous, something that had been hiding beneath the official narrative like a second shadow. And as I watched him, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't just a tragedy anymore, it was a case, and cases had outcomes. When he finally set the phone down, he looked at the blanket with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was disbelief that a piece of cloth meant for swaddling a newborn was at the center of something so monstrous. He told me without hesitation that what I brought him wasn't just suspicious, it was actionable, it was evidence, enough to reopen the investigation, enough to challenge the ruling of accidental death. Enough to make the police reconsider everything they had once accepted as truth. Enough to put my daughter-in-law directly in the line of scrutiny. His certainty steadied me in a way I didn't expect. For months, I had carried doubts in silence, wondering if grief was warping my perceptions. But now an outsider saw the same pattern I did. The secrecy, the fear, the messages that didn't read like arguments but strategy, the financial inconsistencies, the staged chaos, the timing, the deletions, the missing wallet incidents, the cold texts, the final time-stamped message, "It's done." I realized then that my son had not been paranoid, he had been in danger, and no one had listened. There is nothing more powerful than a truth that refuses to stay buried. The lawyer explained the next steps: preserving digital evidence, submitting formal requests, examining insurance documents, requesting autopsy clarifications, initiating a wrongful death petition. The process was overwhelming, but I absorbed every word because this wasn't just about justice. It was about protecting my granddaughter from growing up in the shadow of someone capable of unthinkable things. As I left his office, the cool air hit my face, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to relief, not because the battle was won, but because it had finally begun. The phone in my purse no longer felt like a weight, it felt like armor. Proof my son had trusted me to uncover the truth he couldn't speak aloud. I walked home slowly, every step echoing with newfound clarity. My daughter-in-law had spent months believing she was safe, believing she had discarded the last piece of evidence. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that a grandmother's love is stronger than fear, stronger than manipulation, stronger than the lies meant to bury her child's story. Because as I stepped back into my house, one truth pulsed inside me like a heartbeat. I wasn't just holding evidence anymore, I was holding the future of the person who took my son's life. Why is it that the objects carrying the heaviest pain are the very things we refuse to let go of? Some endings don't roar. Some endings don't roar. They don't explode. They don't arrive with some dramatic announcement that everything is finally over and justice has been served. Sometimes, endings arrive quietly, soft as the click of a closing drawer, gentle as the sigh you release when you finally understand you've survived something meant to break you. For months after meeting with the lawyer, my world moved in cautious motions, like someone tiptoeing around broken glass. Investigations were opened, statements were taken, evidence was cataloged, subpoenas were issued. And my daughter-in-law, once the person who stood in my kitchen bragging about her perfect family, found herself sitting under fluorescent lights, answering questions she never imagined anyone would dare ask her. But even as the legal system untangled the knot she created, my life didn't suddenly feel lighter. Healing never arrives in a single moment. It arrives in fragments, small breaths, quiet mornings, unexpected strength. It arrives in ways that surprise you. And I learned healing can come even while the storm is still raging around you. The first week after the investigation reopened felt like walking through fog. I waited for updates, waited for proof, waited for someone to say what I already knew in my bones, that my son hadn't died by accident, and I hadn't failed him by sensing that truth far too late. But beneath the waiting was something more powerful than fear purpose. A quiet, steady purpose that kept my hands from shaking whenever the lawyer called. A purpose that allowed me to answer every question with clarity instead of collapse. A purpose that reminded me I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it for a man who never got the chance to speak for himself. For a child who deserved to grow up free of lies. For a truth that refused to stay buried. When the police finally confirmed what the messages, photos, and recordings already showed, my legs nearly gave out. Not because I was surprised. No, the truth had been whispering inside me from the moment that blanket landed in the trash, but because hearing it aloud was like reopening a wound I had only just learned to breathe around. Yet with the pain came vindication, not satisfaction, not triumph. Just quiet, exhausted validation. My instincts hadn't betrayed me. My son hadn't imagined his suffering. My granddaughter hadn't been safe. And the woman who smiled at me across dinner tables, who called me Mom, with a sweetness that always tasted artificial, had indeed been hiding a darkness I couldn't see until it was nearly too late. The cruelest monsters are the ones who learn to blend into the family portrait. But while the legal machinery turned, my daily life shifted into something softer, slower, more intentional. I spent more time in the sunlit corners of my house, letting the warmth touch my skin like a reminder that life still existed beyond grief. I opened windows, letting fresh air replace months of heaviness. I cooked small meals again, not because I was hungry, but because nourishment felt like an act of defiance against the sorrow that once swallowed me whole. I spoke to the lawyer often, but I also spoke to myself, quietly, truthfully, forgivingly. I began to understand something I never expected to learn at my age. Healing is not the same as forgetting. Healing is remembering without bleeding. I kept my granddaughter close, closer than ever. I became the safe place she could always run to, the one consistent presence in a world she would someday learn had almost been stolen from her. When she visited, she'd run through my hallway with her little socks sliding on the floor, her laughter echoing against the walls that once held only silence. And every time she jumped into my arms, something in my heart stitched itself a little tighter, a little stronger, a little braver. I was determined that she would grow up knowing love not as something that frightened or controlled, but as something that protected, something that nurtured, something that stayed. There were nights, though, quiet, late nights, when I'd sit on the edge of my bed and pull open the top drawer of my nightstand. And inside, folded with a tenderness most people reserve for sacred things, rested that baby blanket. The same blanket my son once wrapped around his daughter's legs with trembling, gentle hands. The same blanket my daughter-in-law tried to erase from existence. The same blanket that guarded the truth she hoped no one would ever discover. Sometimes, I'd simply hold it. Not to relive the pain, but to honor the power it carried. Because that blanket didn't just expose a lie, it became the bridge between my son's suffering and my newfound strength. It still smelled faintly of lavender, though the scent had faded into something softer, something almost nostalgic. And whenever I pressed the fabric to my chest, I felt my son's presence, not in a haunting way, but in a guiding one, as if he had left a piece of his spirit woven into its threads. It reminded me that mothers are not just protectors while their children live. Sometimes we become warriors long after they're gone. The trial took time. These things always do. But eventually, the truth settled into the world like a stone sinking into still water, permanent, undeniable, unmovable. My daughter-in-law lost everything she tried to steal. She faced consequences she thought she was too clever to ever meet. She was exposed not because she made a mistake, but because she underestimated the one person she believed would stay quiet. Back. A mother, a grandmother, a woman who had already lost the love of her life and refused to lose her son's truth as well. People often ask me how I stayed strong through all of it, how I didn't collapse under the weight of grief and betrayal, how I didn't crumble when the evidence became too much to bear. The answer isn't heroic. It isn't poetic. It's simple. I didn't stay strong. I just wouldn't let myself break where the wrong people could see it. Now, years later, the blanket still rests in my drawer, not as a wound, not as a source of sorrow, but as a reminder. A reminder that even the smallest thread can unravel the darkest lie. A reminder that truth can hide in the quietest places. A reminder that love, real love, does not die when a heart stops beating. It transforms, it protects, it guides. And every time I open that drawer and see the soft yellow fabric folded neatly inside, I remember the lesson that saved my granddaughter's life and reclaimed my son's story. Sometimes the smallest things speak the loudest truths, if only we're brave enough to listen.